Commas are difficult, and some people use them all the time and other people never use them. In today's video, I'm going to cover 3 basic comma rules you can apply immediately to your own writing to make sure that you do at least these 3 rules correctly all the time. And especially rule number 3 is one I see very often, so make sure you stay till the end so you know what definitely to avoid. As a bonus, I'm going to talk about the Oxford comma, and we can see whether the Oxford comma is something you must use or you shouldn't use. So let's solve these common mistakes regarding commas. So the first rule we need to cover is adding a comma after an introductory phrase. In English, when you end an introductory phrase and you move on to the rest of the sentence, you need to add a comma after the introductory phrase. Take the following example. After reading about commas, comma, the students made no more mistakes. The first part, after reading about commas, is an introductory phrase and we need to have a comma here. Here's another example. Before eating their Thanksgiving dinner, the family said grace. Before eating their Thanksgiving dinner is the introductory phrase and we need to add a comma here as well. When your introductory phrase is rather short, usually less than 4 words, we can leave out the comma. But there are cases in which you kind of need the comma even though you have a very short introductory phrase. Let's go back at the family having dinner to illustrate what I mean. Here we have the sentence, before eating, the family said grace. And before eating is our introductory phrase. Now I put the comma here because if I would leave it out, you would get something like, before eating, the family said grace. So even though we know we're not eating the family, you could interpret the sentence like you're eating the family, or you could interpret it as, before eating the family said grace. So we add a comma here because we definitely want to illustrate that before eating is the introductory phrase. The second common mistake I see very often is when writers add a comma after the subject. So in English we never add a comma after the subject, even when the subject is very long. Now if the subject is very short, you might not really want to add a comma, as is the case for the sentence, the house is green. You would never add a comma after the house. But if the subject gets longer, you might be tempted to add a comma after the subject, but you shouldn't do that. Take the following sentence with a very long subject. The boy whose mother and father have black hair has green eyes. You hear in my intonation that I kind of paused there because I want to illustrate that we're ending the subject. But even though I pause in my reading, we wouldn't add a comma. So you wouldn't get, the boy whose mother and father have black hair, comma, has green eyes, because this is incorrect. Now there is a case where you might add commas here, and that is when we want to create a relative clause. Part of the subject is a relative clause, and in this case it's a defining or restrictive relative clause, which means we don't put it between commas. If you want to make it a non-restrictive clause or a non-defining relative clause, we add commas. So we get something like, the boy, comma, whose mother and father have black hair, comma, has green eyes. Now I don't want to dive deep into relative clauses, but the way we use commas or don't use commas regarding relative clauses changes the meaning of the sentence and changes the meaning of the subject as well. So in a defining relative clause, you get a different meaning to the sentence than in a non-defining relative clause. So the only instance in which you would add a comma after the subject is if you have a non-defining relative clause. The third and final common mistake I see very often, which is also the one you can solve very easily, is when learners combine 2 simple sentences with a comma. And this is what we call a comma splice. So when you have 2 independent clauses, you shouldn't combine them with a comma. Take the following sentences. Here we have 2 simple sentences, which are both 2 independent clauses. The boy kicked the ball, comma, the girl read a book. Now here we have a classic comma splice, because we have these 2 simple sentences. How can we solve this? Well, doing this is very easy. We can simply add a coordinating conjunction. This means that we add one of the fanboys to the sentence. So we get something like, the boy kicked the ball, comma, and the girl read a book. Now it is very important that you remember that if we have 2 independent clauses and we combine them with a coordinating conjunction, we do add the comma before the coordinating conjunction. So, as I illustrated in my previous sentence, the boy kicked the ball, comma, and the girl read a book. We always need a comma before one of those coordinating conjunctions. Another way we can solve a comma splice is by changing the way we combine these sentences. So instead of using a comma, and if you don't want to add a coordinating conjunction, you can also add a semicolon. Finally, you could also simply create two simple sentences by adding a full stop and starting the second sentence with a capital letter. But as you know from my sentence structure video, we like to have long sentences, so using a coordinating conjunction is the best way to go. So here we have another sentence with a comma splice, and I'm going to show you how to solve it. The two men are high-fiving, comma, the others are talking. We can simply solve this by adding "and", so we'll get something like, the two men are high-fiving, comma, and the others are talking. Finally, we need to talk about this Oxford comma thing, which is also known as a serial comma. Let's look at an example of a sentence with and without an Oxford comma. Making bread requires milk, flour, and butter. Making bread requires milk, comma, flour, comma, and butter. The second sentence contains the Oxford comma. So let's answer this ongoing question. Should you use the Oxford comma? Well, the answer is, depends on your stylistic choice. If you want, you can use the Oxford comma, but if you don't want to use it, you don't have to. What is very important with these stylistic choices is that whatever you choose, you do it consistently. This means that if you choose to use the Oxford comma, you should use it consistently all the time. And the same goes for if you choose not to use it. Does this mean that it's all done? Well, no. There's one instance or one particular context in which you might want to use the Oxford comma to avoid ambiguities. Take the following two sentences in which the first one doesn't have the Oxford comma and the second one does. I want to dedicate this thesis to my teachers, comma, my mother and my father. I want to dedicate this thesis to my teachers, comma, my mother, comma, and my father. In the first sentence, it kind of sounds like your mother and father are your teachers. And in the second sentence, your mother and father are not your teachers. In the second one, they're part of the list. You have your teachers, your mother, and your father. Whereas in the first sentence, they're not part of a list. They're used to explain who your teachers are. And that's basically it when it comes to the comma. These are three basic comma rules. There are some more rules regarding the commas, but I think if you do these three correctly, you can definitely avoid the most common mistakes people make regarding commas. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. For now, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in one of my next Writing Essentials videos. Leave something in the comments. Leave something in the comments. The boy kicked the ball and the girl threw the shoe. No, the boy kicked the ball and the girl read a book.